The story begins in near darkness, a single flickering torch casting long, quivering shadows across the stone walls of a grand hall. A man kneels on the cold marble floor, his head bowed in feigned humility, yet his eyes are fixed on the figure seated high above, the ruler of the realm. The court around them breathes in silent anticipation, waiting for the next command. No one in that moment could guess that the man kneeling, a slave, little more than property in the eyes of the court, would one day risk everything to end the life of the most feared man in the kingdom. This slave's journey began far from the marble and gold of the palace. He was born in a small village on the empire's outer frontier, a place where the land bled into wilderness and the mountains seemed older than memory itself. His people were farmers and herders, fiercely independent and often caught between rival powers. When the empire expanded into their lands, it came with a force of iron and fire, legions marching in perfect formation, siege engines groaning toward the walls of resistance, and emissaries offering peace in exchange for obedience. Those who refused were crushed. His village fought, but against the war machine of the empire, their resistance lasted only days. In the chaos, families were torn apart, homes burned, and hundreds were taken captive. Among them was a boy who would grow to be the ruler's most unlikely enemy. In the empire, slavery was not merely a labor system, it was a political tool, a way to project dominance. Captured enemies were paraded through streets as trophies, a living testament to the ruler's power. They were assigned to households, work crews, or, in rare cases, the inner court, where beauty, skill, or intelligence could elevate a slave's status, without ever freeing them from bondage. Our subject, though still young, showed an unusual sharpness of mind. He learned the empire's language quickly, studied its customs, and learned when to speak and when to hold his tongue. This adaptability spared him from the grueling labor of the mines or fields. Instead, he was placed in service at the palace, a silent shadow in the halls of power. The ruler he served was a man both admired and feared. Victorious in battle, he was known for his cunning in diplomacy and his ruthlessness toward rivals. To the people, he was a protector of order; to his enemies, he was an architect of terror. The palace itself reflected his reign, walls hung with banners from conquered lands, courtyards filled with statues of war heroes, and guards posted at every corner. Inside this gilded cage, the slave observed everything, the alliances whispered over wine, the punishments dealt in public for maximum humiliation, and the moments when even the ruler's mask of confidence seemed to slip. In these early years of servitude, survival meant invisibility. He learned how to blend into the background, to appear as nothing more than a piece of moving furniture. But invisibility had its advantage, it allowed him to listen. He heard secrets no soldier would dare repeat, saw gestures between nobles that hinted at betrayal, and began to understand the machinery of the empire's politics. Still, for years, he harbored no open defiance. Escape was impossible, rebellion was suicide. But each day, the ruler's cruelty carved another mark into the slave's memory. The moment that changed everything came without warning. One evening, the court gathered to celebrate a military victory, a crushing defeat dealt to rebels in the north. The ruler, in high spirits, demanded entertainment from his slaves. When the young man hesitated, perhaps too slow to bring a goblet or too quiet to answer, the ruler mocked him before the assembled court. A single insult turned into a public spectacle. The ruler struck him, the sound echoing in the chamber, and forced him to kneel until the feast ended. Hours later, as the torches burned low, the young man still knelt, muscles trembling, humiliated before nobles and servants alike. Something in him shifted that night, not a spark, but a quiet, steady flame. He could endure his own suffering, but he could not forgive the way it was meant to display his submission to all others. That humiliation was not just personal, it was political. And it demanded an answer. From that night on, the palace no longer seemed merely a prison, it became a map. Every corridor, guard post, and servant's passage was a potential route, an opportunity, or a danger. Every word spoken in confidence between generals, or whispered among discontented courtiers, was a fragment of a larger puzzle. The ruler's habits, from the hour he rose to the way he trusted certain guards over others, were all pieces of a pattern. The slave began to collect them, storing them away as a soldier might sharpen a hidden blade. This is where our story truly begins, not in open defiance, but in the silent, calculated patience of a man who knows that revenge is a long game. The seeds of conspiracy had been planted in the soil of humiliation, watered by observation, and would one day bear the most dangerous fruit, a plot to kill a king. As the camera lingers on his face in the torchlight, we leave the first chapter with a question burning in the viewer's mind: how does a man with nothing become the deadliest threat to the most powerful ruler in the land? The palace by day was a spectacle of order, marble columns bathed in sunlight, polished floors reflecting the wealth of the empire, and courtyards where diplomats in embroidered robes exchanged formal greetings. But by night, it became a place of whispers. Torches threw restless shadows down the long halls, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken deals and unrecorded betrayals. Here, in the labyrinth of chambers and corridors, the slave found himself not just a servant but a witness to the quiet wars fought beyond the battlefield. The ruler presided over this world like a god among mortals. He was a man of military genius whose campaigns had carved the empire's borders deeper into hostile lands. But those victories came at a price. Behind the grandeur was a court where ambition bred distrust. Every noble feared the other's rise, every general suspected another's loyalty, and the ruler himself trusted almost no one. It was a culture in which a flattering smile could be followed by a poisoned cup. Survival here meant watching everything, and forgetting nothing. The slave's duties placed him in the ruler's immediate orbit. He poured wine at the royal table, delivered sealed letters to generals, and prepared the ruler's chambers before nightfall. Every task, however menial, gave him glimpses into the machinery of power. He learned which generals were summoned more often, and which were kept waiting. He noticed which courtiers leaned close when speaking, as though the walls themselves might betray them. And he understood that in this place, silence was both shield and sword. History tells us that in many ancient courts, slaves in such positions could rise to unofficial influence, not through formal authority, but by being invisible enough to overhear, remember, and, when the moment came, act. The ruler's own paranoia, meant to protect him, often deepened the opportunities for those like the slave. He rotated his guards regularly, never slept in the same bed twice in a week, and kept the schedule of state meetings unpredictable. But even in unpredictability, patterns emerged for those patient enough to look. The court itself was a stage for calculated performance. Feasts celebrated military triumphs with displays of wealth, golden cups, roasted game, dancers moving to the rhythm of drums. But beneath the music and laughter, deals were struck. A single nod from the ruler could determine the fate of a province. A single misstep by a courtier could lead to exile, or worse. The slave began to map not just the rooms of the palace but the relationships that filled them, who stood closest to the ruler at feasts, who avoided eye contact, who was emboldened by drink. Every small detail was another thread in the web he was weaving. Yet this was also the most dangerous phase of his life. To gather information, he had to move in spaces where suspicion already ran high. A wrong glance could lead to a guard's question. A misplaced step could place him in the wrong room at the wrong time. He had seen what happened to those accused of disloyalty, their bodies paraded through the streets as warnings to others. And unlike nobles, who might bargain for mercy, a slave accused of treason had no appeal, no trial, no final speech, only the executioner's blade. Still, the slave's value to the ruler increased. He was given responsibilities that placed him closer to sensitive matters, cleaning the ruler's armor after ceremonies, carrying messages to distant wings of the palace, even standing just behind the throne during certain audiences. The closer he came to the center of power, the more he saw its vulnerabilities. The ruler's paranoia could never erase the fact that he was human. He grew tired, trusted some men more than others, and sometimes allowed routine to dull his caution. The slave, watching silently, understood that every empire's walls had cracks. By now, the idea of killing the ruler was no longer an unformed ember of anger, it was a plan beginning to take shape. And in a court where everyone was scheming for advantage, his hatred could hide in plain sight. The nobles plotted against each other openly enough that one more pair of calculating eyes was never noticed. This was the paradox of the palace. In a place built to guard the ruler, the sheer volume of treachery made one more plot nearly invisible. As this section closes, the audience sees the slave in the dim glow of the palace's inner hallways, passing behind columns as muffled voices echo from the throne room. He moves with the quiet confidence of a man who now knows the rhythms of this world. The court was dangerous, but danger, he had learned, could be navigated. And somewhere, hidden beneath the swirl of luxury and fear, the first true outlines of assassination had begun to form. The palace was a fortress of stone and steel, yet its greatest defenses were not the walls or the guards, they were fear and loyalty. To kill a ruler here was to fight both. The slave knew that no matter how precise his knowledge of the palace, no matter how much humiliation and anger drove him, he could not act alone. A single man's blade might strike once, but a conspiracy could make it strike true. His first step was to search for cracks in the court's facade, men and women whose loyalty to the ruler was already poisoned. These were not easy to find. Many who grumbled in private still feared the ruler enough to inform on anyone who spoke treason aloud. So he began with small tests, an offhand remark about the ruler's cruelty, a quiet sigh at the mention of another tax increase. Most would answer with polite silence or a cautious change of subject. But a few, a very few, let their eyes flicker with something dangerous, resentment. One of the first to show that spark was a palace guard, a veteran of the ruler's northern campaign. The slave had seen him before, limping slightly from an old wound, often posted far from the throne room. Late one night, delivering wine to the guardhouse, the slave overheard him telling another soldier of promises the ruler had broken, land never granted, gold never paid. It was enough to begin a conversation days later, disguised as idle chatter that slowly grew into mutual understanding. Both had debts with the ruler that could never be repaid in coin. The conspiracy grew in shadows, a kitchen worker who had lost her brother to the ruler's purges, a minor court official whose family estates had been seized. Each was approached with patience, never hurried, and always in the most ordinary settings, over bread in the servants' quarters, or while sweeping the outer corridors. The slave used the one advantage he had over most rebels, his invisibility. A noble caught whispering could be accused, a slave speaking softly in a corner was rarely noticed. Still, secrecy was not enough. They needed a plan that could bypass the ruler's layers of protection. In those days, rulers surrounded themselves with rings of defense, outer gates guarded by soldiers, inner halls watched by trusted retainers, and finally the personal guard who slept near their master's chambers. Any plot would have to strike during a moment of reduced vigilance, when ceremony or celebration distracted the watchful. Here, history became the conspirator's ally. The ruler's birthday feast was approaching, an event when wine flowed freely and guards were often drawn into the celebrations. Weapons posed another problem. No steel could be carried into the ruler's presence without inspection. The conspirators debated smuggling in a dagger hidden inside a tray of food, or fashioning a weapon from objects already inside the banquet hall. Every suggestion was weighed against the risk of discovery, for in this game, one misstep would mean not just death, but the unraveling of all they had built. Paranoia became a constant companion. The conspirators spoke in half-sentences, leaving words unspoken, trusting each other to fill the gaps. Some nights, the slave would lie awake, wondering if one of them had already betrayed the others in exchange for a promise of pardon. Yet each day without arrest was a small victory, proof that the net was still unseen. By the end of this phase, the conspiracy was no longer a dream born of humiliation. It was a living thing, with its own pulse, its own fragile heartbeat, sustained by desperation and the shared belief that the ruler's death was worth any price. As the feast approached, the palace seemed to breathe more heavily, as if it too sensed that something dark was moving within its walls. The night of the ruler's birthday arrived, draped in gold and danger. The palace glowed with torchlight, its great halls echoing with music and laughter. From the outer gates to the inner court, the air was thick with the scents of roasted meats, spiced wine, and perfumed oil. Everywhere, nobles in silk and velvet mingled, their jeweled hands gesturing over tales of conquest and wealth. It was a night meant to display the ruler's glory, and the conspirators' perfect opportunity. The slave moved among the guests as he had countless times before, his face a mask of servility, his hands steady as he poured wine and carried platters of food. But beneath the calm surface, every nerve was sharpened to a blade's edge. He noted each guard's position, each gap in their attention. The conspirators had timed everything to the rhythm of the feast, when the ruler's attention would be on a performance, when his guards would be distracted by their own cups, when the noise would be loud enough to mask the sound of a strike. In the kitchens earlier that evening, the plan had taken its final shape. The weapon was no gleaming sword but a narrow dagger hidden inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread, an object that would pass through inspection without suspicion. The guard in on the plot had slipped it into the banquet hall hours before the feast began, placing it behind a column near the ruler's high table. It was there now, waiting. The moment approached during the third course, when the ruler called for a toast to his victories. Servants moved forward with goblets, and the music swelled. The slave stepped away from the wine table, slipping behind the column as planned. His fingers closed around the hilt of the dagger, the cool metal a shock against his skin. He breathed once, twice, steadying the pounding in his chest. The conspirators had agreed on the signal, a sudden burst of applause following the conclusion of the dancer's performance. It would be loud enough to drown the sound of movement, and the crowd's eyes would be fixed on the stage. From his vantage point, the slave saw the dancer whirl in her final spin, her bracelets flashing in the torchlight. The applause erupted. He moved. Years of patience condensed into seconds. He stepped toward the ruler, his path disguised as the simple act of delivering a fresh platter to the table. The ruler's head was turned slightly, smiling at a joke from one of his generals. The slave closed the last steps between them, hand tightening on the dagger. But history, like life, rarely follows a clean script. One of the ruler's personal guards shifted unexpectedly, moving to refill the ruler's cup. The motion forced the slave to adjust his approach, slowed by a fraction of a heartbeat. It was enough for the ruler to glance toward him. In that instant, something in the slave's eyes betrayed intent, perhaps a flash of resolve, perhaps the absence of fear. The ruler's smile froze. What happened next was a blur of motion. The slave lunged, the dagger flashing in the torchlight. The ruler recoiled, his chair tipping backward, the blade grazing his shoulder instead of finding its mark. The hall erupted into chaos. Guards surged forward, some drawing swords, others shielding the ruler with their bodies. The conspirators scattered, some caught immediately, others disappearing into the panic. The slave fought to reach the ruler again, but a heavy blow to the side of his head sent him crashing to the floor. The dagger clattered away, lost in the stampede of boots. Within moments, the ruler was hustled from the hall, blood darkening the fabric at his shoulder but his life intact. The music had stopped, the only sounds were shouts, the clash of weapons, and the ragged breathing of men suddenly thrown into mortal struggle. The night meant to celebrate the ruler's supremacy had become a battlefield without walls. As the slave was dragged to his knees, bound and beaten, he lifted his head to meet the ruler's gaze across the hall. There was no plea for mercy in his eyes, only the grim satisfaction of a man who had dared what few would even dream. For an instant, their eyes locked, not as master and servant, but as enemies who had seen each other's true selves. The dagger had failed, but the plot had struck its mark in another way. It had pierced the illusion of the ruler's invincibility. And in a palace built on fear, even a single crack could spread. The palace that had roared with celebration hours earlier now echoed with the sounds of interrogation, the thud of boots, the clink of chains, and the low, muffled cries of the condemned. The failed assassination had transformed the ruler's birthday into a purge. Every guard, servant, and courtier present at the feast was questioned, some dragged away before they could even protest their innocence. The ruler, his shoulder bound in linen, wasted no time in turning fear into control. The conspirators were hunted with a precision only a ruler long steeped in war could command. The guard who had smuggled in the dagger was found before dawn, beaten until his confession spilled into the torchlit air. One by one, the names were forced from lips trembling under pain. The kitchen worker, the minor court official, all were seized, their heads bowed under the weight of the charges they had always known could come. The slave, the central figure in the plot, was kept alive, not out of mercy, but as a tool. The ruler wanted him displayed broken, an example to any who might dare follow his path. For 3 days he was paraded through the streets in chains, a guard at each side, the dagger he had used hanging around his neck like a badge of failure. Crowds gathered, some jeering, some silent, their expressions unreadable. A few pairs of eyes held something different, admiration, or perhaps the dangerous spark of shared resentment, but none dared show it openly. In the palace, the ruler orchestrated the executions with calculated spectacle. The conspirators were brought to the central courtyard, bound to posts under the open sky. The ruler spoke to the assembled court and commoners, his voice cold, his wound displayed as proof of the treachery he had endured. He framed the conspiracy not as an isolated act but as a betrayal against the entire order of the empire, a warning that even the lowest servant could threaten stability if left unchecked. Punishments in the ancient world were as much about theater as justice. Some of the conspirators were beheaded swiftly, others were executed more slowly, their suffering meant to linger in the minds of those who watched. The slave was left until last, forced to witness each death before being led to the execution block. Yet even here, in the shadow of the axe, he refused to plead. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke them clearly, "A ruler who lives in fear will one day die by it." The courtyard fell silent, the ruler's face unreadable in the torchlight. The execution was swift, but its impact was not. The conspirators' bodies were displayed along the palace gates for days, the stench of death mingling with the scent of incense from the temple nearby. But instead of erasing the memory of the attempt, the ruler had immortalized it. In taverns and market stalls, whispers began, of the slave who dared to lift his hand against the throne, of the wound on the ruler's shoulder that no healer could erase. The ruler had survived, but so too had the story. In the years that followed, the empire continued to expand, its banners flying over conquered cities, its armies feared on every border. The ruler's grip on power remained firm, but the scar on his shoulder was a constant reminder, not of pain, but of vulnerability. He had survived an assassin's blade, yet he could never fully banish the knowledge that even within his own palace walls, there had been those willing to risk everything to end his reign. The slave's name was erased from official records. The court chroniclers were instructed to reduce the incident to a footnote, a failed plot by nameless traitors. But history has a way of slipping through cracks in the stone. In whispered stories, in the songs of wandering bards, his identity lived on, not as a servant, but as a man who dared to reach for the one thing denied him since birth, freedom. To some, he was a reckless criminal, to others, a martyr. To all, he became a question that could not easily be silenced. If even the powerless could strike at the throne, what did that mean for the nature of power itself? Assassination attempts have shadowed rulers across the centuries, from the courts of Rome and Byzantium to the palaces of the Ottoman sultans and the halls of medieval Europe. Patterns emerge: the discontented insider, the dangerous intimacy of trusted service, the convergence of personal grievance and political opportunity. The slave's story is but one link in a long chain of defiance, a reminder that absolute power often creates the very enemies who will try to destroy it. The conspiracy failed in its immediate goal, the ruler lived, the empire endured, yet in another sense it succeeded. It planted doubt where there had once been certainty. It whispered into the ears of those who served in silence, "It can be done." And in an empire where obedience was enforced by fear, even a whisper could be dangerous. As the documentary closes, the image fades to the palace gates under a blood-red sunset. The narrator's voice lowers, carrying the weight of a question meant to linger: empires fall not only when their walls are breached from without, but when courage rises from within. How many nameless hands through the centuries have reached for the blade, and how many rulers have slept uneasily because of them? The screen fades to black.